Well, good morning. It is a delight to be with you today. You know, there are a lot of ways that we can mark the beginning of the season of spring. The vernal equinox, the spring equinox is among them. And that's when the days and nights, they're usually one is a little bit longer than the other. But on the equinox in the spring and again in the fall, we have a moment in which the night and the day are equal. And that's coming up here right between the 20th and 21st of March. So it'll be that night when we have everything just completely equal in length. And that's a significant marker in a lot of the world's religions. We're just a couple of days away from that right now, and so today's poetry program is going to celebrate not only the equinox, but signs of rebirth and renewal that come right along with it. There are a lot of holidays that get celebrated worldwide, a lot of cultural milestones for this time of year. In Bosnia, they celebrate something called Chimburihata on March 21st. And in the city park on the banks of the Bosna River, they serve scrambled eggs just out in public to everybody. They make big batches of them and just hand them out for free. It's a sign of new life. Eggs, of course, signs of new life. In Valencia, Spain, Fallas marks the coming equinox by celebrating the memory of St. Joseph. And they've got wild parades and bonfires in celebration of Joseph. Fallas, Fallas, F-A-L-L-A-S, means torch. And so anything that's old and discarded, stuff that's worn out through the winter, just gets tossed into the fire. And they get to start fresh. Marzana is a Polish festival. It's also celebrated on March 21st. And instead of using fire, they use water to put an end to the winter's wrath. So villagers construct a large straw doll representing the Slavic goddess of winter and plague and death. They carry that doll in a great big parade down to the river where they toss her in. And the idea is to drown the death of winter so spring can begin. There is a 3,000-year-old Persian festival of Nowruz. It comes on the equinox, and it marks the beginning of the new year. And it's an ancient festival. It goes back to ancient Persian, Iranian plateau religions. Homes get cleaned out during the weeks leading up to it. Bonfires are lit, songs are sung, poetry recited. Symbols of renewal and fertility and health and beauty and love are collected, and they're placed in people's homes. So I don't know how you want to celebrate the equinox, this marker that says spring is actually going to get here. But I would like for you to at least join me for a moment in some poetry that may be connected to spring or to the vernal equinox. We're going to have several poems here. Swing by Fran Haraway, one called Vernal Equinox by Amy Lowell, At the Equinox by Arthur C., Near Spring Equinox by Jeanetta Calhoun Mish, another one called Equinox, Greta in Poland by Kim Stafford, An Egg Island Equinox by Brendan Galvin, March by Richard Kenney, Lyell's Hypothesis Again by Kenneth Rexroth, and Someone Asks Me to Consider Time by Carla Panciera. So let's go ahead and get started here with Swing by Fran Haraway. Of course, here in Minnesota, we know we're a month or two away from consistently warm weather, but we do know it's coming. So I'd like to begin with Haraway's poem that acknowledges the promise of the season more than the actual arrival of it. It's too soon for the front porch swing. No crocuses are opening. The wind is from the north and chill. No matter. Spring is here. I still am bound to sit and swing out there and feel it in the evening air. It's much too cold. The trees are lean and leafless, not a sign of green. It's foolishness to sit outside. The mockingbird has testified to spring's existence, and I see the buds are on the almond tree. I'm sure it's spring. How do you know? I think a cricket told me so. Oh, Fran Haraway's Swing from Sharing the Seasons, book of poems. All right, let's turn to Amy Lowell. We've had several of her poems on here before. She died in 1925, before she reached the age that I am now, and her poetry career only lasted about a dozen years, but it was prolific. 650 or so poems from her did as much to move the needle of American poetry out of the 19th century and into the 20th toward imagism and modernism. And here she begins with some wonderful alliteration that anticipates and I think energizes the reader, making the twist in the final line a really powerful and poignant question. Vernal Equinox by Amy Lowell. The scent of hyacinths, like a pale mist, lies between me and my book. And the south wind, washing through the room, makes the candles quiver. My nerves sting at a spatter of rain on the shutter, and I am uneasy with the thrusting of green shoots outside in the night. Why are you not here to overpower me with your tense and urgent love? Well, Arthur Shea is a second-generation Chinese-American, and he is the poet laureate of Santa Fe, New Mexico. He was the winner of the 2019 National Book Award, among many, many other accolades. His poetry kind of intentionally avoids narrative and story, because what he likes to lean into instead is the experience of the moment, where you can juxtapose one image against another, almost like a verbal collage, and you leave it to the reader to make all of the connections for themselves. And it's a particularly effective method of writing for a season like this, where we really do pass through a border where we have to make the connections and understand that the season really is changing. So here is Arthur C. at the Equinox. The tide ebbs and reveals orange and purple sea stars. I have no theory of radiance, but after rain evaporates off pine needles, the needles glisten. In the courtyard, we spot the rising shell of a moon, and at the equinox bathe in its gleam. Using all the tides of starlight, we find vicissitude is our charm. On the mudflats of Homer, I catch the tremor when waves start to slide back in, and from Roanoke you carry the leafing jade smoke of willows. Looping out into the world, we thread and return. The lapping waves cover an expanse of mussels clustered on rocks and giving shape to what is unspoken. Forsythia buds and blooms in our arms. The first line of this poem by the 2017-2018 Poet Laureate of Oklahoma, Jeanetta Calhoun Mish, it takes me to my mother's yard. It's always a sign of spring when the crocuses begin to just work their way up through the soil. They're the first little signs of greenery and the first color that will show up in her yard. And she planted crocuses right next to my dad's gravestone. And so out in the cemetery where he's buried, the first little signs of color that come up in the entire cemetery are these tiny crocus buds just kind of peeking their way up, and then they start to open up. Here in Minnesota, in our yard, My wife and I have planted some crocuses, and they tend to be the first sign of color for us too. And they're not going to poke their shoots up for a little while yet. Although after a day like today, with all of this warmth, who knows what they'll do. But they do certainly help me to shake off winter. This one's called Near Spring Equinox. A ruby crocus near the porch sends up hope. Winter of sorrow is waning. The dire moon of almost spring rises full with promise of renewal, shaming twinkling city lights in its splendor. I search for my faith, wonder where I lost it, find it in deep cinnamon mud smushing up between my toes. Across a spent field, a lake in shadow serenades curvature of earth. As if on cue, a comet streaks across somber, roiling river of sky. All right, how about another poem from a poet laureate? This one, the 9th poet laureate of Oregon, so named in 2018. Kim Stafford founded the Northwest Writing Institute in 1987, and during the first months of the COVID-19 pandemic, he wrote and posted a poem a day on Instagram. In Equinox, Greta in Poland, he juxtaposes governmental authority and, of course, the United Nations, and the passionate intensity of a certain teenage environmental activist, Greta Thunberg, who spoke, you may recall, to the UN climate conference in Poland. Because they were rich and clever, all the ambassadors designed an echo chamber of glass and platitudes and took turns denying the future. And because they were old, only the next few years mattered. And so they pushed around tarnished words like chess pieces in their narrow grid: progress, growth, stability. Words any child could see were obscene, were a screen obscuring catastrophe. So Greta stood and showed them what maturity looks like, what truth sounds like, what leadership feels like. And then she went home to change us. Our next one's by Brendan Galvin, and it's called An Egg Island Equinox. Galvin's been writing nature poetry for decades, and it's won him many awards. This poem works on several different levels. There's the human role in the changing of nature's landscapes, the persistent fragility of nature. Egg Island, at least there are several in the world, but this one in particular is close to where he lives. It's in Lewis Bay. It's on the south coast of Cape Cod, in Massachusetts. And it's not so much of an island anymore as it is a shoal that mostly goes underwater at each high tide. It's right at, if you've got the bay kind of coming around, sort of like this, it's right over here. It's in this little spot where ships can get through, but every high tide, it's easier to get through there, and people will anchor there just to get into the bay. And then when the tide goes down, you start to see a little bit more land emerging. And all of this shoaling that goes on in Lewis Bay is the result of increased ship channel traffic. And so there's this sense of, our human effects on the environment, and certainly a call for us to take responsibility for it. So An Egg Island Equinox by Brendan Galvin. There is no radical shift of light, or redwings calling areas of marsh their territories yet, nor plovers probing for copepods. Only a yellow front-end loader laying out a new berm on the beach from tubes too heavy to be called hoses. Its audience, one man and his protesting dog. No frosted wedding cake on tour, no Captain Beauregard hailing us from the Texas deck, no Texas deck. Just an unshaven crew launching zodiacs from the county dredge. Its twin stacks staining itself and the air with smoke, as battered an emblem of hope as any other. So spring comes to Egg Island, squealing and unwilling, sulfur and diesel, flywheel, gear, and grind, until one morning the equinox dawns and silences the whole shebang. This next poem is by Richard Kenney, and he gave an interview with Poetry Magazine in which he was asked some questions about this poem. March is full of wild music, poncho, banjo, witty, insincerity, yodel, daffodil, all these wonderful kind of bouncy musical words, hauteur, water mutter, oxen, equinox, did, and grit. And they asked him, what about that particular month? What about it? What is it about March that elicits these ebullient rhymes? And he says, he's appealing to March's rumbustible reputation. He says that this poem doesn't go out like a lamb. He says, the fault is in myself and not my rain hats. I remember James Merrill once suggested I might stop banging the casseroles. He declined he'd ever said such a thing, but I understood him to be speaking about style, not content. He did once write a little more gently, if no less pointedly, that one might want to resist the temptation to play Mozart in transcriptions by Liszt. I didn't quite understand that at the time. A quarter century later, I understand, and find myself unregenerate. I have a weakness for acoustical bombast. Isn't that a great phrase? And to be able to recognize that somebody has it and to recognize it themselves. I do understand that one person's Luna moth in a banjo may be another person's percussion hammer in an ear trumpet. He speaks a lot about music in poetry, and I think you'll hear a little bit of music in this one. Some of that bombast. March by Richard Kenney. Sky a shook poncho, roof rung, mind a Luna moth caught in a banjo. This weather's witty, peekaboo. A study in insincerity. Blues, blooms, the yodel of the chimney and night wind, that flat daffodil. With absurd hauteur, new tulips dab their shadows in water mutter. Boys are such oxen. Girls, sepal shudder, shadow waver, equinox. Plums on the quad did blossom all at once, taking down the power grid. Kenneth Rexroth was certainly a rebel of a poet. He had a kind of bombast of his own, I suppose. And he was revered and reviled at the same time when he was writing, but certainly he made an enormous mark on 20th century American poetry. And here he is going to begin with a little bit of geology, which I think that might not be a bad thing. The subtitle of Lyell's book, Principles of Geology, is the epigram for this poem, Lyell's Hypothesis Again, by Kenneth Rexroth. An attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by causes now in operation. Subtitle of Lyell, Principles of Geology. The mountain road ends here, broken away in the chasm where the bridge washed out years ago. The first scarlet larkspur glitters in the first patch of April morning sunlight. The engorged creek roars and rustles like a military ball. Here by the waterfall, insuperable life, flushed with the equinox, sentient and sentimental, falls away to the sea and death. The tissue of sympathy and agony that binds the flesh in its Nessus shirt, the clotted cobweb of unself and self, sheds itself and flecks the sun's bed with darts of blossom like flagellant blood above the water bursting in the vibrant air. This ego, bound by personal tragedy, and the vast impersonal vindictiveness of the ruined and ruining world pauses in this immortality, as passionate, as apathetic as the lava flow that burned here once, and stopped here, and said, "This far, and no further," and spoke thereafter in the simple diction of stone. Naked in the warm April air, we lie under the redwoods, in the sunny lee of a cliff. As you kneel above me, I see tiny red marks on your flanks like bites, where the redwood cones have pressed into your flesh. You can find just the same marks in the lignite in the cliff over our heads. Sequoia Langsdorffii before the ice, and sempervirens afterwards. There is little difference, except for all those years. Here in the sweet, moribund fetor of spring flowers, washed, flotsam and jetsam together, cool and naked together under this tree for a moment, we have escaped the bitterness of love and love lost and love betrayed, and what might have been, and what might be, fall equally away with what is, and leave only these ideograms printed on the immortal hydrocarbons of flesh and stone. Kind of starts out like geology, but it sure sounds a lot like love to me. A poem by Carla Panciera called "Someone Asks Me to Consider Time." And isn't that an appropriate subject for us when we are marking time with the equinox? Think of, the equinox marks not only a lot of the holidays that I'd mentioned earlier, but it's actually part of the dating of Easter. I don't know if you knew about how Easter gets its date. You know, it changes every year. Well, it's the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. So with the equinox coming, we know Easter's on its way. Passover, of course, is also tied to the moon after the equinox. So here's "Someone Asks Me to Consider Time." Kant says time is neither event nor thing. Well, I think that's that. But then Teresa calls. She's found my old letters. There are dead dogs in them, old boyfriends. The miscarriage is happening, has happened, and I have to catch a plane. The plane has not yet taken off. Sundials, T-squares, heartbeats, and the equinox. In places of worship, incense burns, all to mark no thing. Here, wind moves water in one direction, then another. Some mornings nothing ripples, not leaves, not iridescence on bird wing, beetle back. Some mornings, both. Stillness, unrest. Last season's loon calls. And sometimes I can't remember the lake where I first heard that sound, though the vision of it rises through a paint-flecked pane. On my morning walk, a hawk, perched on a telephone wire above what used to be a hayfield, rusted New Holland, Baylor, bobolinks, and meadowlarks saved from the mower. That was a generation ago. Dead farmers, dead cows. Now is not the time. Moles, voles, mice to dart into the light. Nothing stops in stillness except solstice, when the sun stands still in declination. I should tell someone this, that we are not propelled beyond a moment of observation, even loss, into something else. Field edge, lakeside, motherhood. But that instead, we are always on our way. On my return, the wire is empty, the hawk has hunted or not, is sated or continues hungry. Hunger at least returns. Once in different water, my daughters waded naked after mussels. Appendages these daughters were. I was accustomed to the creases behind their knees where I kept their pulse. Keep these two. Ship's bells and steeple chimes, an hourglass, the Pharaoh's water clock. Now on a floating dock, my daughters sun themselves, swing limbs above water that soon enough will be ice. These days you can lift saliva off the back of a stamp, determine who licked it, and that woman, that sender, she will have stopped, and she will not yet have stopped, and she will still be bleeding. This one's called Look to the Crocus by Marion McCready. This one's called Look to the Crocus by Marion McCready. And again, it brings up spring for me, probably more than any other flower, I think. Eyelids are the final petals closing on this life. When I die, place crocuses on my eyes. They will guide me. I kneel down next to the crocuses, touch them gingerly as if they were puppies with pin teeth jumping excitedly in the firth breeze. At last, the snow has left us, cleaned the earth for crocuses, luxurious as silky hair or oiled skin. Don't be fooled. Crocuses are as wild as a fairground wheel, spinning out of control. The crocuses were coughed up out of the ground. They are scattered around tree trunks like residue from a terrible accident. They are purple tears, hand-sewn to the earth. We are all survivors in this life, but none more so than the crocus, embedded in the grass, like a microchip gathering the history of the world. Crocuses are submarines moving silently through green waves. The crocuses seem to be melting among snowdrops like ice cream with the wet look of a frog, their orange tongue pistils barely visible. Crocuses are satellites in the grass watching us. They know us better than we know ourselves. Look to the crocus. Do not stand on the purple crocus. It will remember your footprint. Like elephants, they never forget. The crocus beckons like homemade liqueur, each one a glassful of sunlight. The crocus is a soft word in my ear. The crocus is my best self. I carry them around in my head like a song. I want to crawl inside of their purple armor, dwell in the honeyed saffron filaments at their center. Thank God, when the final curtain falls, it is made of crocuses. Well, I do wish you crocuses this spring, this equinox. They may not be coming up immediately, but I imagine they'll be coming up soon. I know they'll be coming up soon, because after winter, spring always comes. And there's an affirmation in that celebrated the world over in spiritual traditions and religions that go back not just hundreds, but even thousands of years. We recognize in this annual renewal of life, as the seasons pass, that time itself is something we can shape and we can frame it and we can participate in it and find meaning in the way that we mark it. But it's something also that we pass through. And in passing through it, we come out again on the other side. I do wish you crocuses, a little bit of life poking up through the dirt, and I wish you peace.